Good afternoon, folks. This is Steve Armstrong, Social Studies Consultant for the state of Connecticut. And this afternoon, thank you for joining us. We're taking part in the second in our webinar series on the frameworks and on inquiry. Today's session is on what is an overview on inquiry, what inquiry really means, and also on Dimension 1, asking questions. Today's presenters will be John Tully from Central Connecticut State University, Tony Roy from the Connecticut River Academy, Melanie Meehan from the Simsbury Public Schools, and Dave Basso from the Berlin Public Schools. And the format for the inquiry the format for the webinar will be, if anyone has questions or comments, please write them in. We're not going to have the participants speak. So any comments you have, any questions you have, if you're a participant, simply write them in, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go. All right, so we're going to go for about an hour today. And again, please participate. Anything that you want to know that these fine folks are talking about, please ask. So Tony Roy is going to be our first speaker today. So Tony, take it away.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. How are you doing this afternoon? Let's go ahead and move on to, just go ahead and skip 2 slides here, Steve, please. And while Steve is doing that, basically, we're going to begin with a question. And the question today is, what is inquiry? So if people could go ahead and type in to the message box there what inquiry is and hit enter, we can start to share those out.
Mr. Moses, if you're in the building, please call the sponsor at 2852. Mr. Moses, please call.
You know, so while we're waiting for people to kind of get acclimated with putting that in there, you know, what you're seeing here is on the left-hand side is a graphic that we created that some members of the Connecticut Connecticut Council for the Social Studies made this past year as a way to advertise our fall conference that we had, which was pretty successful. We had a lot of different sessions that were going on, and we're actually in the process of planning our next conference, which is coming up again in October. And then there's also some other professional development opportunities coming up on March 24th, which is like a leadership conference, and then some other things that are going to be happening this summer. So it says here that one response here is that inquiry is the effort to have students explore and discover rather than repeat kind of like information and things like that. And if there's any others, maybe we could hear some of those. Dave says here that it's a process by which people and students are engaged in learning the research, thinking, developing positions and ideas. I mean, these are all pretty good here. And then Kelly says here a process of investigation that uses both primary and secondary sources. All right, so we have a couple different responses here. Why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide, please? Really, inquiry is, in my opinion, the genesis of innovation. You know, the image that we see on the right here is actually the Genius of Connecticut, which is a bronze statue that was once perched on top of the Capitol Dome to represent the importance of innovation in sustaining our state. It was melted down for the war effort in 1942 and recast in 2007 with state-of-the-art 3D scanners. So actually, at the time, this was the largest 3D scan operation that was ever conducted. And I guess what's the point of this, right? Connecticut's residents have consistently been leaders in innovation. So much of the inquiry arc actually comes naturally to us. And we're actually going to come back to this idea of innovation and the importance of innovation a little bit later in the presentation. So if we could go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. All right, so what we have here is basically overview of the dimensions. You can see in the picture on the right-hand side just an illustration of what each of these dimensions are. And you can see that we start with asking questions and planning inquiries, moving along to applying disciplinary concepts and tools, evaluating sources and using evidence, and then finally communicating conclusions and taking informed action. Basically, this is through the inquiry process, students work independently and interdependently to ask questions, apply disciplinary lenses, work with source materials, communicate their conclusions, and take informed actions. I mean, C3 is really the basis of this, which was, I think it was published probably about 3 years ago, and that is basically what the new social studies frameworks are based on. And you can learn more about the social studies frameworks by going through and looking at a previously archived webinar, which is available through the this Connecticut State Department website. We can go on to the next slide, please. Dimension 1 is the beginning of that, and really it's all about questions and the desire to answer them, giving life to inquiry. And here's an example directly out of the Connecticut Social Studies Framework, which is for U.S. history, which is basically asking, in what ways and for whom was America the land of opportunity in the 1950s? Right, so this is something that kind of drives instruction. This is something where students are compelled to want to try to answer this question and look for sources that would help answer them. They would go ahead and develop conclusions about this and probably, I don't know, write about it or speak about it, communicate the result in some way. We can move on to the next slide, please. Dimension 2 basically is applying disciplinary concepts and tools. There's 4 core disciplines which align basically with 4 like social studies fields, I guess you could say. I mean, these are really unique ways of thinking and organizing knowledge. We're talking about the actual work that political scientists do on a daily basis, or that economists do on a daily basis, geographers, historians, right? If we go on to the next slide, I have an example for you. So here we have, if you look at the bottom, you actually have this standard that's listed here. And this is a 2nd grade standard, and I was hoping that maybe you might be able to match this indicator, excuse me, these are indicators, not standards, you can match this indicator with one of these economics concepts above, right? So economics, actually all of the disciplines, economics, civics, geography, and history are broken down into, I guess you could say, disciplinary concepts. So does anyone think that we could maybe match that economic standard, or excuse me, indicator to one of the concepts above? If you could just submit that into the box. You know, while we're waiting here, basically each of these is broken down in a way that helps you look at, well, in this case, economics through a different lens. We have some responses here. So so basically, what I'm looking for is the standard that's written at the bottom here. Which one of these economics disciplinary concepts do you think it falls into? Like, does it fit with economic decision making? Does it fit with exchange and markets, the national economy, the global economy? Well, in the conservation of time, I guess I'll just help you out with this one. This one is actually exchange and markets, right? So looking at the goods and services that people provide in the local community has to do with exchange and markets. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Here's another example for geography. As you can see here, geography is broken down into 4 sections here with geographic representations, working with maps, human environment interaction, population, meaning like spatial patterns and movements, and then finally global interconnections, which is changing spatial patterns. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Dimension 3 is basically where you are working resources. This is vital literacy skills. close text reading, notation, and the development of discipline-specific claims. This is basically where students will be working with source materials to answer questions and to be able to wrestle with the disciplinary concepts that they're trying to apply. We can move on to the next slide. And then finally, we end with Dimension 4, which is communicating conclusions and taking informed action. This is where students collaborate with others as they communicate and critique conclusions in public venues. And later webinars are going to really get into what this dimension really entails, but I can give you a quick synopsis or how we've used it in our school. Basically, in 10th grade, we have civics, and the students work on a civic engagement portfolio where they select an issue, research the issue, create an action plan, and then finally implement that action plan to take action and then evaluate their results at the end in the form of a portfolio that they present to the rest of the class. And basically, that's how we have students in our school work with sources to end up taking informed action. And we can move on to the next slide.
So basically, and this is Melanie speaking now, we want to ask, why does all of this matter in our classrooms? We have this fabulous inquiry arc. We can envision the idea of getting students to ask questions. Many, many years ago, a man by the name of Voltaire came up with the quote of, "Judge a man by his questions rather than his answers." I would suggest to Voltaire that maybe we could judge a woman by her questions rather than her answers, or we could at least have a judge a person. But I think that it's a really wonderful statement to think about how we can push people to wonder and be curious about the world that we live in, rather than just be on the hunt for answers of questions that we're posing to them. And that being said, central to the rich social studies experience is the capability for developing questions that can frame and advance an inquiry. So it's not just about us giving questions to students, but it's really about us inspiring students to develop their own questions that lead to a sustained inquiry and really inspire them to want to do more research and develop more questions that support the original question. Dave, I'm not sure if you're here. You had some specific instances that you wanted to share being in the classroom?
Right. So if we can advance to the next slide. So a couple of things related to this chart, and some of you have maybe have seen both of these charts. Typically what we see is that, and we all know children have a lot of questions, and they ask questions about a lot of things. There's that natural curiosity that all children have, and as we progress through school and we grow, a lot of those questions start, or the questioning intensity and the questioning volume starts to diminish. You'll notice on the left-hand side that the reading and writing skills become obviously much more active, and that's part of the nature of our schooling environment. But we also, unfortunately, have some situations where questioning is not as valued and it's not as encouraged. And so what we are suggesting, and what the C3 and what the Connecticut State Framework suggests, is that using inquiry can support this level of questioning and on the part of our students, so as to really get more involved in their own relevant connections and information that they'll be looking at and becoming more engaged with it. You'll also notice there was a Gallup poll taken in 2014 that they refer to as a school cliff, and you'll see that the level of engagement drops as well. And there are obviously any number of factors that can contribute to this, but we feel very strongly that the social studies classroom is one of the primary vehicles by which we can increase the level of student engagement. While we will get into other specific examples later on, I can tell you that simply by making the transition where we are really just kind of scratching the surface of getting students to ask their own questions, the level of engagement has noticeably increased. And when any sort of activity that's a result of that initial inquiry that's led by the students, that's focused on something that is interesting to them, obviously within the parameters of what you have set forth as a teacher and connected to the curriculum. The level of engagement remains high. And when it's coupled with some sort of product or some way by which students communicate conclusions and their new understandings, there's a level of excitement and engagement that I think a somewhat systematic approach to developing inquiry, which is what the C3 and the Connecticut frameworks are about, the level of engagement is very, very high and very strong. And we'll get into some more specific examples of how that might, or what that might look like in a classroom.
Yeah, I would just add on this slide, you know, Dave, when you think about it, you're envisioning high school students. When I'm thinking about it, I'm envisioning elementary school students. And when we have students ask questions and have those questions almost serve as headers for information writing, the quality of their writing goes way up. The level of engagement goes up, but the quality of the writing goes way up as well. So just another testimony to why this matters. Next slide, please.
Okay, so this is John. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the and but problems we've had as we've done some different things over the summer and as Steve's been going around the districts. And one of the impediments, or at least what people think are sometimes an impediment to using inquiry at the secondary level, is that it's time to get the students ready to take a whole lot of notes, because that's what they'll need to do in college. And really that's not the case. It's not the case, hasn't been the case for a while, and I think the pace at which that is changing is really exciting. University faculty we're far more concerned about historical thinking skills than having students memorize historical facts. Each class that I teach starts without the assumption of deep background knowledge. When I teach my class in the Cold War, the Vietnam War, we start from scratch. I'm much more interested in having students who can ask questions about the sources, who can ask questions about the topic and use that interest to take them forward. I think one of the important things that's helping push that along, and the evidence that that's happening, is a lot of Sam Weinberg's work out of Stanford. All of the major journals, the the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association, now have teaching sections. And I think as more academic historians have worked with secondary teachers as part of the Teach American History grant programs, that has helped shape our new understanding. And I'm using inquiry in my classroom. Many of my colleagues at Central are. It's really something that's moving ahead. There's one example there. We can add more in the resources, and I'd be happy to talk with people. Even at the survey level at the university, we're moving far away from the just a reciting of things and having students repeat it. We're really looking at inquiry. So this is what you would do in your secondary classrooms will really help prepare students for the college classrooms of the future. So next slide, please, Steve.
All right, now that John kind of told us like what the end game is here, that we're trying to get everyone ready to be really high-functioning participants at the college level, and obviously in career and in civic life. It all, again, begins with compelling questions. And compelling questions are both provocative and critical to the field. Students should inquire about how things work, the diverse interpretations, and unresolved issues. Some teachers ask about what the difference is between essential and compelling questions. And according to Grant Wiggins, both push students to uncover the depth and richness of a topic. But he also says that compelling questions are more discipline specific, whereas essential questions are more open-ended, right? So this is a little bit of the difference between compelling and essential questions that many people are working with, especially if you are familiar with understanding by design. All right, next slide, please. Supporting questions really help to answer those compelling questions. And I'll give you an example of something from my classroom. I just started a new elective. It's called Urban Studies. And basically, we're looking into how decisions from the past shape housing equity today. And beginning with that question, I had the students basically, we're going to learn more about what a question formulation technique is a little bit later, but they started with this structure called the question formulation technique, and then moved into looking at, then we had them actually looking directly at the standards I wanted to learn and picking out the key concepts. And then we were revising our questions that we came up with to better fit those key concepts. And then we were making the questions better. Then finally, we ended up with 3 pretty solid supporting questions. One dealing with how does public policy impact urban housing today. Another one being how do economic decisions impact the way that people live. And then finally, how can we, or what changes can be made to create housing equity. So the students came up with these questions, and they are so, I mean, I guess this sounds like, okay, yeah, here's the teacher saying that they're so compelled, but these students are really, really compelled with these ideas and trying to learn more about these topics, and they're saying, oh wow, this connects to my life because I saw this here, or I was talking with a family member of mine about these questions, and they were giving me this piece of information. So I mean, it really sparks some natural curiosity. If you go ahead to the next slide, we can show you an example of one that is in the Connecticut Social Studies Framework. We have this high school history compelling question that I gave to you before about opportunity in the 1950s. And here are some suggested supporting questions you find in that same document. Basically, the supporting questions, you can see that the key concepts that these questions deal with range from economic and social opportunities to participation in the political process, right? So these are questions that are more concrete, whereas compelling questions are a little bit more overarching and require you to dig down deep, and there is no defined answer, whereas in these, again, these supporting questions have a little bit more of a defined answer. And you can move on to the next slide.
So this is Melanie speaking again, and certainly one of the things that we have to really think about when we're envisioning inquiry in classrooms is how we teach students about different questions. How does that sort of instruction happen in our classrooms? So we thought we would stop and pause here and just have some people contribute some of the ideas and ways that they have talked to students at all levels about the different kinds of questions that there are. We do a lot of work here in Simsbury talking to students about open-ended and closed-ended questions, giving lessons about that. We're just wondering about what other experiences people who are here have had in terms of teaching students about different questions. So I'm going to pause and give a little bit of time for you to just contribute some ideas.
Melanie, this is, I'll type it to everyone because we're getting a little feedback on my end.
So while Steve is typing and while people are maybe thinking about different ways they have taught about questions, I would just refer everybody to thinking about going in and digging into a blog by Warren Berger. He writes really great articles about the importance of inquiry. He has written about, he wrote the book, Ask a More Beautiful Question, or A More Beautiful Question. And I'm just watching some of the questions coming in and getting distracted. John, I'm not positive how we see those answers. Or Steve, I'm not sure how we see those answers that are coming in.
Melanie, John's going to give you, summarize the questions and give them to you right now.
Okay, so we have somebody, Dave is sharing what he has observed during a learning experience where he used materials from the SHAG, which is Stanford, that asked if the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, prompted some terrific discussions in small groups. So again, that's really using the inquiry process to get great conversations going. You know, I think another way that we really can think about teaching students about questions is talking to them about questions that you can answer via Google versus questions that you can't answer via Google. What can you type in and get an instant answer for? What do you what do you have to grapple with more? What are the questions that require bigger thinking than just a single answer? Those sorts of lessons are really fun to do with students and to talk to them about. May I have the next slide, please?
Melanie, you've got a couple, I don't know if you could see them on your screen, you've got a couple other responses there too.
I'm seeing, I'm seeing Dave Grundle asking about wanting to learn more about the civic engagement portfolio. I'm not sure that was talked about within this. But I don't see other answers, Steve. I'm sorry. Those are the answers.
Just try scrolling down a bit and you may see
them. Talk about from Terry, talking about what the question is asking. This may include definitions of words within the questions. So really having students dig in and understand what questions are asking, I think that's a wonderful idea. Again, I think I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so, you know, when we're thinking about the different strategies for teaching students to ask questions, I think one of the biggest things that I see teachers do and that I know I always work on in school is modeling that curiosity. Like just being on the hunt of stopping in the middle of an article and kind of gasping a little bit with, wait, how could that be? And emphasizing the idea of asking, what are you wondering? What questions do we have? What do I want to know? What do I want to know more? When we were working on a Christopher Columbus article with a bunch of fifth graders, one of the facts that students went flying through was the length of the boat that Christopher Columbus and his crew sailed on. And the library media specialist and I sort of looked at each other and said, wait a second, how big is that boat? How long is that in terms of how long this library is and how many people are on that? And wait, how long were they on that for? And all of a sudden there were many, many more questions that were going on with that because we were modeling curiosity and we were reacting to that text. So I think that the more that we do that and we make it safe for students to react and wonder to whatever is put in front of them, the more that you'll see students asking meaningful questions within classrooms. As far as thinking about the classroom activities and connections that we have, I think that so many of us, especially in language arts and in the elementary level, are doing a lot of inquiry work, and maybe we don't always realize that we are. And sometimes also, if you just make small tweaks in some of your practice so that you're giving more power to students insofar as the questioning is concerned, you'll find yourself having more inquiry within the classrooms. So an example of it that I will give you is during one of our read-alouds just this morning. Instead of reading a picture book to a group of fourth graders and stopping and pausing and asking them questions, I had them asking questions. So instead of me directing the conversation, it was them directing the conversation, and they really did a wonderful job and asked really, really meaningful questions in that text. So is it similar to a stop and jot that we language arts elementary teachers might already do? Absolutely. But instead of it being a stop and jot, it might be a stop and write down 3 questions that you're having right now. Stop and write down 3 wonderings. Let's generate a few questions and see if one of them could turn into a turn and talk. And that way the power is given to the students to really be doing some of the wondering. I think that some of that same work can work with book talks and book clubs. When you start teaching students to ask meaningful questions, you start giving them power to have much better conversations. Once you get them through the idea that you can ask open-ended questions, or you can ask closed-ended questions, or thick and thin questions, or Googleable or non-Googleable questions, then you really open up the doors to meaningful conversations that they can use in their book clubs and in their book talks. Text sets are a fabulous way to really build these sorts of questioning skills. We've given you on one of the final slides some resources for finding text sets. Some of them are hard to find and they're hard to build because text sets require similar lexile levels in text, and it's not always easy to build, so we've provided those sources. But basically what a text set does is it gives many different perspectives about a similar topic, and it's a fabulous thing to use within social studies. One final plug I would give is the concept of inquiry cards. One of the ways that we've been teaching here is to develop inquiry cards for specific topics. For example, we have inquiry cards that go along with exploration, and that's how we introduce exploration in 5th grade. We have 4 or 5 cards that have different maps, 4 or 5 cards that have different timelines, 4 or 5 cards that have different pictures, 4 or 5 cards that have different technologies that existed, and even some that have some short text. And so students go to each center and they're required to ask questions and try to build connections and understandings by looking at the information that's presented on those sets of cards. So again, with just always the emphasis being that we want to build and support curiosity, and we want to build and support the capacity to wonder and ask meaningful questions that inspire students to want to dig deeper and explore the concepts. Next slide, please. So we're going to ask for some more audience participation here, because one of the ways that we can get students to ask some questions is to provide them with a stimulus, and pictures are a great source of those. Short videos are a great source. Basically, anything that can be presented to them in less than a couple of minutes, you know, pictures certainly are within that they can ask questions. So, you know, even this morning, I was having students ask questions and then stay with one question. So I'm going to ask if people could just look at this picture and work to generate some questions that they might have. This is a picture from about Colonial School, and I wouldn't really give students too much more than that about it, and I would really push them to start asking questions about it. Love it. Who is in the picture? What else can we get? What are they doing? Other questions people might come up with from this picture. Are those all of the students, or are there more? Again, I'm going to keep pushing. Can we get some more questions out of that? They don't look very comfortable. What is on the head of the student on the left? That's one of my favorite questions that I always go to. I'm like, why is he wearing that hat? Is the boy with the hat in trouble? Okay, so now I'm going to hit a pause on the questions. And I would say to you, all right, pick one question and let's just go deeper on that question. You might try to push to start your questions with what if, but if we just take that one question, let's say, is the boy with the hat in trouble, and stay with that one and just ask a few more questions that just have to do with the boy with the hat. Go ahead, try it out. Just questions that have to do with the boy with the hat. Maybe they start with what if. Maybe they don't. Maybe they're just digging deeper to what's the purpose of that hat. Okay, I'm not seeing a whole lot more. We're going to stay and linger with this just a little longer. What else? How else could we dig into the question about that boy with the hat and whether he's in trouble? And so we might have gotten into what did he do to get in trouble? If he's in trouble, why would he be smiling? What's in his hands? I love that, looking closely at what might be in his hands. How long does he stand there? In any case, that's the kind of work where students really end up digging in. And, you know, again, just this morning, I watched students just stay and really linger with one question. And the level of thinking and the work that comes out of it and the work that's inspired by it is really worth taking the time. So next question, or next slide, please. You know, I think that one of the things that's always useful for teachers is to see different charts for teaching students to ask questions. So on the left, one of the things that I had seen and loved in another classroom was the idea of using thinking prompts, but also using questioning prompts. So in many of our workshop-oriented classrooms, we have thinking prompts. You know, some people think, but I think. In other words, what I'm meaning to say, those sorts of thinking prompts. We can also have questioning prompts for students. So in some of the classrooms that I'm working with, we're starting to see the charts that have these questioning prompts that just support students as they learn how to ask better questions. The chart on the right is a chart that I had made, and this is you know, it's not a beautiful chart, but it was a chart made on the fly with a 5th grade classroom where students were working hard to define the difference between open-ended and closed-ended questions. So we were really taking their suggestions and their input to define those sorts of questions. That's why their initials are on there, so that they really own it. And they were able to make some pretty great generalizations about the differences between open-ended and closed-ended questions. Next slide, please. Again, I know that charts always inspire me as a teacher, but when we started teaching the inquiry arc to a group of 4th grade and 5th graders, we told them that we were going to be working really hard to think about topics and really emphasize wonder and curiosity. So we built this chart that's on the left, telling them that they were going to be responsible for producing questions, categorizing questions, prioritizing those questions, and then thinking about what their next steps and reflection would be. So that was a chart that we referred to kind of throughout the whole process, where students were going through, asking the questions, doing their research, and giving their presentations. The chart on the right is an example of the work that I did kind of as the lead learner in the classroom, asking a lot of different questions about global warming. I used that as my teaching topic, so that was my model topic as I was working through the process with them, where I was just inspiring them and showing them how I start asking questions as a learner when I start wanting to know more and more about global warming. That chart inspired them to do that same kind of work in their notebooks about their own topics. So again, feel free to use any of these charts in classrooms. They're there to be modeled, tweaked, changed, used. Next slide, please.
Okay, at this point, I'd like to provide just sort of an overview of what a few people have already referred to, and that is the question formulation technique. One of the minor shifts that I've made in my classroom is to start using this in a variety of cases. And while I don't follow it step by step, partly because of some of the curricular demands, there are definitely places where this minor change can make a big difference in terms of the overall level of the student engagement. And so QFT is the question formulation technique. What's in front of us are the rules that were put forth by the Right Question Institute, which is on our resources slide that we'll get to towards the end. But very quickly, ask as many questions as possible. Don't judge, answer, or discuss. Write down every question exactly as stated and take any statements and turn them into questions. And it's important to go over these rules with the students prior to starting any sort of inquiry activity, whether it's a quick hit opening activity or something that might be a little bit longer in duration. And it's also important to continue to refer to these because there might be some time that goes by in between starting a new inquiry. So that's generally the rules, and at this point I'm going to go through the steps that you would undertake. So if we can go to the next slide, and it outlines the general steps. So just to kind of take you through this, one of the most important things that we can do is choose a question focus. And this sometimes takes some time, but it's important to have it grounded in the curriculum. And this could be anything, a political cartoon, an audio file, there's a few other examples there, any sort of image that might be essentially a hook that's, again, connected toward, or at least leading to some of the ways that you might want students to get involved and get into this deeper. And then we'll ask the students to produce as many questions as they can within a certain time frame. And so that's the initial stage of all this. And then the very important stage comes in the third part there, where students improve questions. And this bears a little bit more explanation. One of the first things that might be very useful, especially early in the year when beginning this process, is to ask students, maybe even provide examples as to what might be an example of a closed question, what might be an example of an open question. And there'll be, I teach mostly grade 9. I imagine that middle school students and elementary school students can certainly take a look at different types of questions and get a sense of what might be a more specific question, what might be more open-ended question, and then to ask them the advantages and disadvantages of each. And that's very important because it gets them to get a sense of what sorts of questions lead to different types of activities. The grade 9 students that I have took to this very well, and they had a really good sense of the value of each type of question. And the closed and open types of questions generally parallel the idea of supporting and compelling questions. And so as they produce the questions, oftentimes I'll have them initially do the questioning, whatever it is, whatever the question focus is, on their own to begin with, and then to pair up or to get into a small group and maybe even generate more questions. In fact, I've almost inserted that as a rule myself, where not only are you producing questions, but you might add new ones based on sharing them out. And then we ask the students to identify them as closed or open. And part of the improving process, typically what I have the students do is to take any closed and make them open. As part of the very specific QFT process, if we were following the exact formula, they would also ask students to take any open and turn them into closed, just to have the practice of working with different types of questions. But in the effort to get closer to what might be an overarching compelling question, I typically have the students go from closed to open. And then I ask them to rank them, obviously to work with them a little bit more, but also so it sets us up so that there can be a share out. So each group might give us their top 2 questions. And we'll use those, and as a class, we will continue to improve them. So the improving process isn't over just because we moved on to the step, but it's a constant improving process. And then we'll ask them to categorize them. Which types of questions are supporting, which types of questions are compelling, and of course they have some of that already they haven't gone through the close and open process. And all throughout, there should be a reflection that's taken place. So we're going to do a quick practice with this, and this is one that I've done. So what I'm going to ask before we go to the next slide is when you see the image, if you can just very quickly type in the first question or two that comes into your head, and I should be able to read them out. And so we'll take maybe a minute or so to take a look at the picture. So let's go to that slide there. Let's go to the next, yep, that one. So generate any questions that you have, as many as you can. Let's take a minute to do that now, please. Okay, and like Melanie, typically what I will do, depending on what sort of responses we get, it might be to kind of hint at certain parts of the image. And again, it's rooted in the curriculum. This was part of our unit that we're just wrapping up about power, authority, and governance. So here are some of the questions that just came up. What is the time period? When was this drawn? Who is in the pic? What does each animal represent? What is the artist thinking or expressing? And a lot of times students will ask questions where they do want another question, which animal is the U.S.? Students do want the immediate answers, and typically I'll say to them to write down that question, add that as a question. And to be honest, there's a little level of frustration sometimes with that because they're used to getting those immediate responses. This is a shift. I said it was a minor shift. Typically what I would have done in the past is to put this picture up, and maybe I myself as a teacher would have asked questions of the students. So it's kind of it seems like a minor shift in some ways, but it's not much of a shift, but in terms of level of engagement, it's a major one. And so what we would do with this is we would talk about the different types of questions, and a lot of the questions that we came up with typically might be along the lines of more closed types of questions where we can get quick answers, immediate answers, and we would work to improve upon these. And so one of the things that I've done and I found very helpful is I've given the students question stems that might make them more open. So I have told them something such as starting a question with "in what ways" or "to what extent" tend to open up those questions a little bit more. So with that, the students might take some of those supporting questions and combine them or talk about them and turn it into a question such as, in what ways does this image represent European influence in different parts of the world? Something like that. In what ways or to what extent does this image accurately portray tensions at the time? And now that we've done this a few times, students are getting better and better with the questions. And I've also told them that it's really not about the picture, it's what the picture represents. I've asked them at times to take what might be specific references in the picture and to open those up a little bit more. So for example, there was an image we used that was with Mao Zedong, and they made reference to Mao Zedong because we had spent some time talking about that time period in China. And I wanted them to get more compelling questions out of that. And so I said, replace Mao with, say, a ruler. How can this question be applied to different time periods and to different parts of the world? And with that knowledge, they do get much better at opening those up. So I know that was very, very quick, but I can, again, testify to the fact that just this little shift in having the students ask the questions with some sort of hook, or what they call a question focus, can be a quick hit thing where it's just to start out a lesson. It can be something that you establish as a foundation for the next couple of days of a lesson. Any way that you use this will no doubt increase the overall level of engagement. I think at this time we have some resources that we can quickly go through.
Next slide, please. Resources are always helpful when you're trying to do this sort of work. So we have some websites that are really useful websites. Dave, I'm going to ask you to speak to the C3 teachers one because I know that you even do some writing for that one.
Right. So the C3 Teachers is basically a website that has a number of blogs from various teachers who have started to use inquiry and various aspects of the C3 in their classroom. And so some of it is very specific about what teachers have done and some of the challenges they found and some of the successes that they found. And so there's a pretty wide variety of teachers throughout the country who have blogged for C3 teachers.
Yeah.
This is Steve. I'm sorry. Could I also add in on that one? If you're looking for specific, if you want to see examples of inquiries, they have for every grade. If you hunt around a little bit, K through high school, they've got 8 inquiries per grade. So if you want to see what a kindergarten inquiry is like, if you want to see what a high school inquiry is like, they're all there. And if you hunt actually under hubs, if you hunt under New York, if you want to do professional development for your district, there's PowerPoints there, there's videos there. So this is really a website worth exploring.
Okay. So the rightquestion.org is a website that's actually not just education specific, but it is where you'll find the steps to the question formulation technique that Dave went over with. It has just an infinite number of innovative ideas and different sorts of questions and ways that we can use them within our classrooms. Warren Berger has done some fabulous work about the power of inquiry. His website is full of reasons to improve questioning. He also has a blog, and he's got many ideas within his blog about how to do that. We have some specific articles that he's written on the next page, so you'll see those. The Visible Thinking website has very specific techniques that you can use in order to build higher student engagement, many of them through improving questions. So if you want just really specific how-tos, you can find. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we compiled several different articles that mostly are short and really give you good overviews or some very practical ideas for implementing inquiry in here. And again, we've annotated a bit so that you know exactly what the overall emphasis of that article is. One of the articles, the second one, is an article by Dave. Dave, do you want to give that one a plug?
Yeah, that's just a quick article about how inquiry can, again, lead to that greater level of engagement. I don't want to go too much into it because I know we have a few others to talk about, and I think we should also leave some time for questions with about 5 minutes left here.
Okay. Next slide, please. The final slide that we have is just, again, it's a slide of resources where you can find text sets, you can find stimuli. You know, one of the things that we were talking about is the idea of having pictures or political cartoons or videos. Sometimes they're hard to find. Some of these websites are fabulous places for finding those sort of resources. So again, they're annotated. They're there for your best use. So I think at this
next slide. Oh, my fault. Sorry, I thought you were done.
Yeah, I think at this point we were wanting to sort of open up the floor to any sorts of questions or final comments people have.
This is Steve, and I have a question for John, Tony, Melanie, or Dave. What strategies would you suggest? Because sometimes when I work in districts, there's people who say, well, you know what, if you're going to do this inquiry, there's critical content. We get the inquiry, but there's critical content that kids should be learning. This is usually also a middle school and high school audience comment. And if you were to spend time on inquiry, how do we decide what content we're not going to teach? Would any of you want to? What's a good way to counter that argument?
I guess I can instead of countering it, I guess I would just say, you know, what's the purpose of teaching? You know, is the purpose of teaching for the students to walk away with something they know and understand and can use for a lifetime, or is it just to recall some facts that you might say on a test, right? So I'm thinking about when I was in high school, it was a lot of true-false tests and multiple choice tests. But what we're doing here is we're actually doing something that's much more rigorous, where we're working with multiple sources. And I'm not sure if anyone works with like depth of knowledge, which is something I've just been recently introduced to, but this is much deeper knowledge forming and using tools that are going to be more applicable to real world. So it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to have them just recite some facts, I guess then the traditional way of teaching is the way to go. But if you really want them to have some skills that they can work with, then you want them to actually learn it through inquiry.
Right. I think that another way that you can really make sure that on some of the content that you know is within with what stimulus and what pictures and what content cards and inquiry cards and books you put in front of them. So when you are challenging students to ask questions, you're challenging them to ask questions through a medium that is supporting the content that you're responsible for. And the other piece of that's so wonderful about the question formulation technique is that you can kind of end up having students find their own way to the compelling questions and the essential questions that you are needing to cover.
Have we answered the last slide?
Could I just ask the four of you, in your own classrooms, I'm curious, do you do all inquiry, a combination of inquiry and quote-unquote traditional teaching? I'd be curious about that. Can you go all inquiry, or should it be some combination?
Well, I can tell you that in my classes, it's been a combination, and I think it's a healthy combination. Inquiry is great and it has its place, but there's also any number of factors that would really involve a lot of what we might call traditional ways that in and of themselves are very effective as well.
We've done the same as that in an elementary version, Dave. I know you're speaking probably more from a high school perspective, and one of the phrases that we have taken from Teachers College, where we get a lot of our inspiration, has been the concept of mini lectures. So we have what we're terming mini lectures combined with some of the inquiry. So it's definitely a combination.
I would also agree that it's a combination where I'm at, but I would say it's a combination because I'm still in transition to figure out how is it that we can make sure that we're still having students come in contact with the necessary content in a way that's deep and meaningful. So the only reason that I would say that I'm not quote unquote 100% inquiry would be because I'm just not at that level yet, right? So I'm still resting on some of these more traditional practices. And then as you can see here, this last slide is basically where you're going to be able to find the archived webinars. If you have any questions, you can go to the State Department of Education website here. And I'm sure someone has some closing remarks they'd like to make.
Yeah, I'd like to sorry about that. Thanks to everybody for your participation, and John, Tony, Melanie, and Dave. That was all very informative and good for people that don't know much about inquiry or are putting their toe into it. Great information today. Greatly appreciated. Anyone have a last comment they'd like to make?
No, thank you for this opportunity to present.
Thanks a lot, folks. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Night.